when we're thinking, we're always thinking about knowledge. So when I'm thinking about European exploration in North America, I need to know that there was such a boat and such an explorer, quote unquote, or that Henry Hudson died, and this kind of thing. But how I think about European exploration makes me a historical thinker rather than just a person who has historical knowledge, which are essentially trivia, which is the trivialization of understanding.
That was a snippet of my conversation with Ted Christou, professor of both history and education at Queen's University. That conversation is coming up here on What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. Now, before we get to that, I wanted to ask you a favor, as I always do. Please spread the word about this show. If you like it, share it on social media. Go to the website, www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. You can find all previous episodes on that website, and you can also find links to social media and to the 2 stations that we broadcast on every week. Please take the time, give it a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app that you use. But the best thing you can probably do is spread the word verbally. Tell your friends. Word of mouth is everything. Now, to the subject at hand, education and the history of education. According to Nelson Mandela, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Some people have said that it is the silver bullet, if there was any, for all of our ills and ailments in society. It's the one thing that we can use to fix the problems that are in front of us. Of course, it can take decades or it can take generations. It can take hundreds of years for education to finally have its full impact. But education is everything. Education is the way that we think about the world. But my conversation with Ted Christou taught me something really important. It's not just education and the structure of education, it's how we think about education. In the same way that if you're in education, it's not memorizing the facts and the figures and memorizing the equations and understanding how to do things. It's how we think about those things that really matters. The greatest value of education is less about knowing and memorizing details, and much more about knowing why those details are important so that we can separate fact from fiction. A skill that is incredibly important in the modern context. Anyways, I really hope you enjoy this interview. I certainly did.
All right, Ted Christou, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to talk a lot about education, the future of education, the history of education, which is something that you've worked in quite a bit. We might even also talk about Byzantine and some of the work you've done in that field. You're with Queen's University, and you have a cross appointment between history and the Faculty of Education, which is actually really quite interesting, especially for someone like me who's quite a history buff. My first question is always the same, and it's going to relate to education in our world today. It's a world of disruption, of flux. We live in a fairly bizarre time. So according to you and the work that you do in your research, what on earth is going on in this world of education and its history and its future?
That is the $64,000 question that everyone in Ontario is asking right now. We're in the middle of a political change, and with that comes an ideological change, a question of what we ought to teach and how we should teach it. And it is actually a battle, an ideological battle between 2 different currents in education that's a century old in Ontario. So, and it's largely provoked by times of flux, as you said.
What are the 2 different forces at play?
So going back to the post-World War I period, we start to hear about something called progressive education. And post-World War I, the world looked differently for people in this province.
Yeah.
People who had come back from the war had seen atrocities no one should ever see. Mm-hmm. Industrialization, urbanization, immigration, as I mentioned, technological changes. And people started voicing in the media and in popular magazines and in educational journals the question, well, the world looks different, but schools haven't changed at all. And so there arose this tension between what was called traditional education and what was called progressive education. what progressive education was, I don't think was very clear to people, other than they wanted to reform, or they wanted to update the schools. And so what you read in these educational journals, which, by the way, don't look anything like educational journals now. They weren't written by professors. They were written by the public. They were written by the Minister of Education. They were written by teachers. They were written by the head of the YMCA, these kinds of articles. What becomes apparent is three main criticisms of traditional schooling. One, as I mentioned, it's that it had lost touch with contemporary life, that schools had been set up in a Victorian age, and that age was gone.
Right.
The second criticism is that these traditional forms of schooling established passive forms of learning. In other words, memorization from textbooks. There were standard textbooks that everyone had across the province. And there was nothing done other than just rote learning. And the third criticism was that the curriculum mattered, and that was it, and the curriculum being these textbooks. So if you flip the narrative, then progressive education is largely about focusing on the individual child, or the individual learner, providing active learning experiences, and connecting to contemporary life. So one of the things we see going on in education now is both a celebration of and a stark criticism of what today's rhetoric calls 21st century learning. If you look at the themes of 21st century learning, they're identical to 1920s, 1930s progressive education.
Right.
And what we also see is that one phase of progressive education is always followed by a phase of traditional schooling.
Okay.
And this goes back again to the post-World War I period. In fact, 1937 was Ontario's first progressive curriculum. And the Minister of Education at the time was Duncan MacArthur, who West Campus at Queen's is actually named after. A former history professor at Queen's, head of history, who then became a school trustee and got embroiled in government at the time. Yeah. So this document from 1937 was actually revolutionary for the time, not in Canada because it was a current going across the country.
Right.
But it introduced two subjects that had never been in schools before explicitly. One was social studies, and one was health. And if we look at the news going on today, just look at Twitter. Look at my Twitter. You'll see that both the social studies curriculum and the health curriculum are the ones that have been repealed immediately by the present progressive conservative government. So the social studies curriculum wasn't exactly repealed nor history, but there were revisions that were set to be made as we speak in Alliston, Ontario, which would align the social studies and history curriculum along with civics with the calls to action number 62 and 63 by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so the health curriculum, would call commonly the sex ed curriculum, but it's not a sex ed curriculum, it's part of the health document, is going to be repealed or has been repealed. It's in the process of being repealed, and maybe not entirely, but to some extent. And the social studies curriculum was affected by the pulling back of the previous government's commitment of funds to revise the documents.
So why is this happening? I mean, there are a lot of people out here who have very different ideas about what education does, about the purpose of education, and I think they have different answers to your two questions, which I wrote down, your two main questions of research, which are, what is an education for, and how might we imagine an educated individual? So people have very different opinions on the answer to those two different questions. And they're politically charged, too. People, especially when it comes to sex education, they have religious views, they have ideological views. This current battle that's going on that you've identified, why is it happening now? I mean, sure, we can identify the proximate cause of Doug Ford becoming the Premier of Ontario, but there are forces at play behind him, there are forces at play in the Progressive Conservative Party, and there are forces at play in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So why is this happening now, and what are they trying to achieve with these different answers to these questions?
I think it boils down to two different human responses to social change, which we
Okay.
started with.
Mhm.
So when the world is changing, or it feels like it's in flux, or it is in flux, or we have a government south of the border that people don't know what's going to happen tomorrow,
Sure.
wars going on all over the world, political questions going all over the world. The two reactions, one is, let's update how we're thinking about things so that we can see the world as it is in a current lens.
Right.
And the second response is, hold on, let's stand strong on traditional ways of doing things. It's gotten us this far. We've survived this many millennia as humans.
Mm.
Things will change, but we shouldn't. We should be steady. And so you see this even in literature. Everyone must learn Shakespeare, or everyone should read manga instead of Shakespeare.
Right. Is this, I mean, I hope I'm not making it too blunt, but is this simply a sort of a left-right divide or a conservative-progressive divide? You know, those who want to protect the traditions and those who want to find a way to move with the times. Again, that's maybe a bit glib, but is that really what we're talking about?
I think the last way you expressed it, people who want to hold on to their traditions and people who want to change with the time.
Right. And I think that it's obvious that things are changing, that we cannot, I mean, a lot of people say we should go back to the halcyon days of the 1950s in North America, when pollution wasn't even discussed, let alone recognized as an issue, beyond maybe some polluted water supplies in isolated areas. It wasn't seen as a global issue. But technology was also not so different than it was 20, 30, 50 years before. We now live in a world where change has undeniably altered the face of society in even someone as young as me, as my lifetime. That if I go back to the 1980s and 90s when I was growing up, we had nothing like the cell phone. The cell phone is this tiny little device that may not change the way the world looks on the surface, but it changes everything in terms of our social functioning, in terms of the way we communicate, in terms of the way that we interact with technology and with information. So it's undeniable that the world has changed. But I guess the question would be, how do we, and what you're asking is how do we alter our education system so that we can appreciate the change through the correct lens? It's not necessarily we just go with the times. I think it's also about how can we arrest these developments so that students can understand what's happening as it really is, rather than take a 19th century perspective and apply it on the present, which would be maybe interesting, but probably also ineffective.
Right. Maybe not the halcyon days of the 50s, but I have spoken to people who have said, "Oh, thank goodness they're going to go back. I hate the new math. The new math stinks."
Right.
The math I learned was the math people should learn. That's how people should learn math.
Right.
And it's the interesting point you make about technology has a lot of aspects to it. And the first is that, like our cell phones, for instance, technology is both a reaction to modernity.
Mm-hmm.
Like so we react to modernity by gripping more to technology, and it is an aspect of modernity. So it is an aspect of our real lives. And so the way I think about this is, well, the world's changing, so I need the new iPhone X, which by the way is terrible. I got it last week.
Good to know. Customer service and our consumer announcement.
Don't upgrade.
Okay. Good to know.
But so this helps me. My phone now helps me make sense of my world. I can get on Twitter. I can read the news. I can take pictures.
Right.
I can look at pictures of cats. I can do all kinds of things on it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it aggravates the distance between us and the past, because it poses this separation from the previous version of the iPhone or the previous ways of doing things.
Right.
And so I mentioned before 21st century learning, which just go online, you'll see lots of stuff about it and lots of rhetoric promoting it in the same way progressive education versus traditional education progressive education is being promoted as opposed to traditional education. If you look at the rhetoric of 21C, as it's abbreviated, it's all about math, science, technology. It's not about the humanities. That's the first part. And because it's largely about technology, it's largely about devices. So there's a group in Canada called Canada for 21st Century. I think it's called C21, I believe is the abbreviation. I'm reading its rhetoric about we should adopt more technology. We should adopt more technology.
Right.
There was even one letter I read that was sent to Premier Wynne, saying something like, "You're going to lose the confidence of the people unless you really embrace this technology."
Yeah.
Right? But if you dig a little deeper and do some investigative work, and I'm going to get in trouble for this, 8 out of 10 founding members are technology corporations. They're Dell, Smart Technologies.
So they have an interest, obviously, in
in
increasing the use of technology. Yeah.
So it's political, and it's also part of our economic times. That that some of the rhetoric going on isn't purely about those two questions that I had asked. Some of them are about interest,
right,
and self-interest, and profit.
Right, of course.
So Google schools, Apple schools.
Yeah.
Why would there be Google schools? They're investing heavily in schools and giving them tons of technology.
Right.
So the kids get hooked really early on. That's the only reason.
I think part of the reason that people have such differing views maybe on education is partly because they're so invested in it. Everyone, I think 99% of people went through some kind of public education. And then, of course, they have children who are in public education. They have a vested interest in their past and in their future and what education is. And therefore, I think it's maybe incumbent upon us in this conversation to ask the question, what is the purpose of education down to its most basic thing? And we're going to probably have a different answer than someone else, because I've talked to people who have said that in their minds, the purpose of education is to prepare you for work and your career, that you should be taking the classes that are aligned for you and what path you're going to take. So if you're going to be a lawyer, not much sense studying physics, except in some basic fundamental ways, so that if you deal with a case that has physics, you've got that going on. But another person might have a more liberal arts view of education, which is to prepare a person for life, to prepare a person for their civic duty, for example. A voter needs to be informed, but also needs to have the faculties of critical reasoning. So if a politician lies, I can interpret that lie, why it's being said, what the magnitude of that lie is, and what it means for the system that we're surrounded by. So with all of this in mind, and that there may be different contexts of this, I want to ask you, and you're someone who has had an enormously broad history in education. You started, I think, as an elementary school teacher. You worked throughout in all kinds of different grades in education, and then you now teaching at a university. Education has been part of your life for your entire adult life. So in the best and maybe most pithy way you can put it, what is education? Like, what is the purpose of it? What do we have it for?
I'm going to dodge the question for a second and go back to some historical points. And I like how you expressed the way that there are different answers to the same question.
Yeah.
What I found in my research and what I've written about is that there are 3 major ones that have manifested themselves in educational history in Ontario.
Okay.
So the first would be social meliorists. These are the people who believe that the purpose of schooling is to make engaged citizens who will go out and make the world a better place.
Okay.
So if this goes back to the 1930s, the kids were doing civic activities of various kinds. There's even stories of kids going out into classrooms and like painting benches and singing at seniors' homes and so on and so forth.
It's almost like community service in a way.
Right? Your purpose in life, essentially, it boils down to your purpose in life is to serve the world, to make the world a better place through your own actions. So that's why you need to be educated, because you can't do that without having certain, we would say ideological, but they're all ideological, or ideas and experiences and knowledge.
And tools, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
So the second group we'd call social efficiency advocates. And these are the people who, going back to your statement, purpose of an education is for you to find your niche in life.
Right.
So that's your work life, that's your other life, whatever it is that you do after school. School should help you get there.
Right.
One of the early things people don't really know is that like guidance programs emerged out of this kind of thinking. The fact that in high schools you students have a homeroom and then cycle throughout the building to different experts or subject experts.
Right.
Came out of the Depression and maximizing the efficiency of the school plant. Like that was the language that was being used.
Right. So it was almost like an assembly line to
That's
get
right.
workers ready for life. Okay.
The fact that you have some core subjects and some electives is kind of an amalgam. So everyone needs to know this level of English, this level of math, this level of science. But then after that, it becomes kind of a shopping cart curriculum. So with your guidance counselor, you can go some form of guidance and support. You take those subjects that will help you get to where you need to be
Right.
or want to go.
Yeah.
The third group would be what I've called developmentalists. And it's largely coming from a psychological background. This involves IQ testing, but also fundamentally, the idea is get out of nature's way. You're a different human being than I am. You have different needs than I do. And we're both like plants in the sunshine. And we need to grow. And then the teacher's job is to be kind of like a gardener, to tend to us and make sure we have the needs we have and allow us to become self-realize into those individuals that we want to become.
Right. I wouldn't say you dodged the question at all. I'd say you answered it. That's exactly what I was looking for.
I didn't tell you my opinion.
Okay, so what's your take on it?
I don't know.
I don't know either. When you propose those three answers to that question, all three of them sound convincing from a certain worldview.
They're all logical.
Right, but all three of them also have drawbacks. There's issues with each of them. For example, if I'm going to take the developmental approach, which I find really interesting, and it sounds right. It sounds logical in the way that me as a human and I want to develop as an individual. But there are aspects to it that might be problematic. For example, if each of us is to go on our own path, well, at some point, the brick and mortar square of a school might not suit me. But what if it doesn't suit 18% of my classmates? What are we to do? Just wander around the grass and figure it out for ourselves? And are we as a society going to hire teachers to make sure that every single group of people and every individual on their own path is given one-on-one time if they're needed, if they're deserving of that? And how does this all pan out when we have a scarcity of resources as a country? And I don't mean to attack it. I'm just trying to say that that's an example of a con for that style and that answer to that question.
Right. And so like all of these different ways of thinking of the world also have different philosophical traditions that are attached to them.
Of course.
So the developmental tradition you can trace, I trace everything back to the Greeks because that's my hair.
Right.
But, sometimes in jest, sometimes not. But I'll trace it here to Rousseau.
Okay.
So Rousseau wrote a novel called Emile, and it was about the ideal education of a young man. And he had a tutor, and he had nature, and all this stuff. And it was great. It's a romantic telling of how a child can grow up and become lack of a better term, a good human being.
Yeah.
But that's one student to one tutor. And exactly what you're saying now, in a class where teachers right now are dealing with 36 students.
Yeah.
How do you fully realize this is a challenge? How do you fully realize a developmentalist ideal of education?
Right.
Even
right.
if you might say in your philosophy statement, or if asked, I believe in child-centered learning and the development of the individual and so on and so forth, you have constraints that make that a challenge.
Well, and it's challenging too politically, because if I believe in the developmental approach, I may not have any choice but to impose the social efficiency approach, because I've only got enough money for one teacher for 36 kids. And I can't afford to do anything else but have a factory producing kids, because I'd rather do that than do nothing at all. And that's one of the choices that we make as a society as a whole. But it's a difficult one. And I mean, and this is where we get into the political questions, because this is such a politically charged topic. How much do you think that politicians who are making decisions about education understand the questions and the answers that we're talking about right now? How much do they get these bare bone fundamentals before they make decisions on sex education or getting rid of grade 13, as was done in Ontario a few years ago? Like, how do they make these calls? And are they prepared to?
I think they make these calls partly because they've campaigned on a particular idea that is attractive or polls well with a larger population than another one.
Yeah.
I think that might be the case with some of these repeals that we're seeing
today.
I think largely we have, as you said, each of us have had our own education and our own upbringing, and we have worldviews. Now, the challenge, and these worldviews kind of manifest themselves in their political ideologies. The problem with the good thing about a worldview is it allows you to see the world in some way.
Right.
The bad thing about a worldview is it's very difficult to examine because you're always looking through it.
Mm.
It would be something like taking out your eyes to look at your eyes. It would
Right.
be a difficult thing.
And how does a worldview see another opposing worldview as anything but a threat to itself? Right? Yeah.
And that might be a little bit reductive, but I do think that, for instance, I mentioned this 1937 curriculum, which was progressive.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have World War II. And then the premier of the province moves from a liberal government to a progressive conservative government. George Drew becomes the premier. He's raised in Upper Canada College. He marries into a very wealthy family. The progressive conservatives are in power in Ontario for something like 45 years, the exact number. But most of the curricular, the progressive aspects of the 37 curriculum slowly get undone. That gets more complicated in the 60s when you have still a progressive conservative government, but Bill Davis is the premier of the province and embraces at least what seems to be a very progressive mindset about education. And maybe it's because it's the 60s.
Yeah.
And he's grown up in this, or this is the zeitgeist. I'm not sure.
Right.
So he funds a huge report called the Living and Learning Document, or commonly known as the Hall-Dennis Report because of its two chairs, Lloyd Dennis and Justice Hall. And this tries to go right back to John Dewey and the 1937 curriculum, explicitly. Big pictures, talking about technology, back to technology and progressivism.
Mm-hmm.
Open classrooms, the kind that people then boarded up later on.
Right.
I remember there were schools that had open spaces. The whole school was an open space. These kinds of ideas. He opens all the faculties of education in the province. He founds Trent University. But he had also been the premier for John Robarts, who was not necessarily so progressive. He's the one who turned Yorkville, which was kind of a hippie area, into the Mink Mile in Toronto. Cleaned up the area, so to speak, quote unquote. So it is complicated. It gets sometimes more complicated. Here we have a clearly conservative government. I'm not sure what Doug Ford's background is. I'm not sure even what his education was. But the decisions now seem far more political than they seem to be ideological, even though, of course, they're tied together.
Well, when we talk about politics, we're talking about something that is intrinsically linked to education from its inception. And in a way that a lot of people maybe haven't thought about or don't realize, partly because, for example, Canada, being a country that started as a confederation in 1867, public education has been a feature of our country since the beginning. But our so-called parent countries in Europe would not say the same thing, obviously. Education, public education as we know it today, is a product of the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, education was the sort of the area, the realm of the church. And it was a privilege, certainly not a right, as it is seen today to be something that is fundamentally entitled to you as a citizen of this society. When we go back to the Industrial Revolution, there's a lot of reasons as why education, public education, became a thing. Whether governments needed to provide this because there was such intense demand by the people, but also there was an intense demand from capital for the labor and the educated labor to run the factories. So when we go back, and just because I know that you're a historian of education, when we go back to the incipients of modern public education, say in the 19th century or earlier or later, what were the driving forces behind it, and how can we appreciate the politics that are therefore intrinsic to this conversation?
I think you've named many of the ones that could possibly be the drivers. Yes, there was a need for educated labor. That seems to be more the case now, where we're really interested in AI. How many
Right.
grads are we going to have in AI?
Mm-hmm.
How many grads do we have in engineering, and so on and so forth? I don't think people kept those kind of metrics in the same way we do. You mentioned the religious dimension. Religious education is kind of forgotten when we're talking about public education, but we do have a religious board
Mm-hmm.
in Ontario. And there, I think the driver is largely to develop good Christian, in this case, citizens or
Mhm.
people of the world,
Right.
which I think there was a fair bit of religious fervor even in people like Egerton Ryerson and so on and so forth, who founded the system in Ontario. So that's one of the harder questions to really answer, because I think it's all of that. Like, so, and sometimes it's just, for instance, people who petitioned to the Queen, to the King rather, to have a university formed at the time, like the University of New Brunswick in 18 whatever it was.
Right.
Who just wanted their, they were loyalists. They had left the United States, and there was no higher education for their students, and they wanted them to their children, and they wanted them to be educated.
Right.
So they said, we need a university. We want higher education. We want these higher ideals or higher ideas. There is a sense of a high and a low, right?
Right.
Which is also there. And, when I think, looking at it from various perspectives, it can be positive and negative. But the sense that a really educated individual has grappled with, this has been a theme as well, has grappled with these great ideas. This is a philosophical thing that goes all the way back to Plato.
Right.
The educated ideal.
Right.
If you haven't read your Plato, if you haven't read your Aristotle, if you haven't read your whatever book it is,
Right.
then you're really not an educated person.
Yeah.
And this I can actually bridge, here's where I bridge, into Byzantium.
Awesome.
I didn't think I was going to be able to do it. For anyone who doesn't know what Byzantium is Rome after it Christianizes in 330, and it persists till 1453. There's often this lie that's perpetrated that Rome fell in 476. It's true. The city of Rome fell in 476. Right. And the western half of the empire, because it had already been divided into two halves, did fall. But the eastern half of the empire never fell. So there was a continuation of the emperor from Constantine, who moved his capital to Constantinople,
right,
now Istanbul, and established that as the new capital of Rome, which persisted for, I said, 1,123 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And there, to be an educated person, you had to be able to be familiar with the classics of Greece and Rome, all of them. So everything from Sophocles to Demosthenes or whoever it is that wrote in, Cicero, etc. Although Latin kind of got lost in the East. And that, the actual driver for that was so that you could pick up the references in others' work. It was kind of a high intelligentsia game. It was a game. But also so that you could be a courtier.
Right.
So the emperor needed educated people who could write letters, read letters, do correspondence, think at a high level. And that was one of the other drivers, right?
Yeah.
Other than being able to play the game.
Sure.
If you couldn't play the game, you couldn't get the job.
Right.
But they also needed people for the job.
Right.
But there was a parallel system of education, which was religious. And so if you didn't know your Gospels, if you didn't go to church and listen to the sermons, if you didn't know the lives of the saints or hagiographies, then you weren't an educated person either.
Yeah.
Because you could never be what I think it was Montesquieu called an ass burdened with books, right? You had to be a person who would live the good life, and the good life was one of an educated person in the traditional sense, but also the person who lived according to the Christian life.
Right, right.
And so these two parallel systems of education existed throughout the history of the Byzantine Empire, but often clashed. So in the 3rd century, for instance, there's the question of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? In other words, why do we need to know these old Greek stuff if we should be looking towards Jerusalem and Christianity and the Christian ideal?
Mm-hmm.
In the 4th century, you have people like Basil of Caesarea or Gregory of Nazianzus or John Chrysostom, who all had a classical education. They went to the equivalent of university, like they'd go to Athens and study rhetoric and philosophy. Others would go to Beirut and study law. That was the center of law, legal education. So they had that classical first form of education. And then they became bishops and talked about how these two things shouldn't be in conflict. They should be in parallel.
Mm-hmm.
But this tension exists like every couple hundred years.
Right.
There's a question of, you're not educated because you just have a religious knowledge, or you're just not educated because you're not religious enough.
Right.
So this kind of gets a long-winded answer to your question.
No, I actually find it a fascinating answer, and you've said about 13 different things that I want to talk about for another half an hour on each one. Not only Byzantium, but the role of education. So I'm going to start with this idea that we have this sort of the split in education. And today the split probably continues. We have a secular education system for the most part, but we know both as students and we know as parents of those students that it's not quite enough. It doesn't create a fully rounded individual, maybe because it's in the social efficacy vein, or social efficiency vein that you've talked about before. And therefore we need to put our kids into karate or have them engaging in sports or in some kind of, whether it's spiritual or a pursuit that makes them feel passionate and engaged, as opposed to just learning things by rote to prepare them for their career. We know that there's already this split, and maybe the Byzantine answer to that, and the answer to that in the Middle Ages, when it became fused again, was to provide religious on the one side and the classics on the other. I'm trying to remember the name of the author. He wrote Foucault's Pendulum.
Umberto Eco.
That's Umberto Eco. That's right. And he wrote a lot about, in the book, In the Name of the Rose, I believe, wrote a lot about scholars who were monks, who were the educational centers of their time in the Middle Ages. But they were also by necessity religious. In fact, I think for the time it was impossible to perceive or conceive of someone who was an intellectual and who was not religious. And the other thing that I'm going to say to all this, and there's 10 more, but to get your response to, is this sense of ideas. And I've actually brought a quote of yours here. You said, we live in a world of ideas rather than of facts. These ideas are elusive and mutable. They need to be approached humbly. Educators who assume to know and venture to teach do so blindly. And I think what's so key about that is we know that there are facts in the world that most of the time are not in dispute. But the world is composed of ideas. And to me, an educated person, there's so many ways you can be educated now. There's Chinese education, Indian education, European, South American, African, Canadian, American, whatever. There's all of these different nodes of education. And if someone passes through, you would consider them to be an educated person, even if they never, say, made any contact with Plato in their line of reasoning or their line of education. But what's so important about this is that without this paradigm that I've grown through, I cannot understand the world that's around me. So Rousseau, for example, the philosopher that you mentioned, if the reason I read Rousseau is not just so that I can play games with other scholars, it's also so that I can understand the world that exists today. Because the world that exists today is not just bricks and mortar. It's not just laws that have been handed down. It's not just Bibles and religious texts. The ideas of Rousseau, the ideas of Plato, the ideas of Chinese philosophers and Indian philosophers have helped to compose the world in which we live, because the world in which we live is not just physical. And if I'm ignorant of these things, and I mean no negativity with the word ignorant, if I don't know these things, then I can't understand the world around me, and I am more of a slave to it than potentially its master. Do you think that that's an accurate assessment of the broader, softer view of education, that it's not just about the games we play and to prepare you for your career, but it's about understanding this world that we live in?
It's funny, you read a quote of mine that I don't entirely agree with. Probably wrote it in another lifetime.
It may have been an introduction to a thought that I just didn't mention. But yeah.
Because facts matter.
Right.
So I'm going to answer the question this way. Knowledge matters. We all know this. We're sitting on the campus of Queen's University. The Holocaust happened. My name is what it is. There are facts, and these matter, and they help shape our ideas and the world. And so we need to know stuff, right? In brief, it's not just enough to think about stuff, but it's important to know stuff. But I think bigger than that, bigger than knowledge, is how we think about the knowledge that we have.
Right. So
we need to know, but how we think about what we know matters more, because we're always thinking about knowledge.
Right.
When we're thinking, we're always thinking about knowledge.
Right.
So when I'm thinking about European exploration in North America, I need to know that there was such a boat and such an explorer, quote unquote, or that Henry Hudson died, and this kind of thing. But how I think about European exploration makes me a historical thinker rather than just a person who has historical knowledge
and learn them by rote,
which are essentially trivia, which is the trivialization of understanding.
Right.
So I need to think about what happened. I need to think, and this is why the canceled TRC work for social studies and history is so burdensome to me, because it would have infused the curriculum with new ways of thinking about the knowledge that we thought we had, or the narratives that we thought we had, or the narratives we grew up with. Even bigger than historical thinking is what I've called historical mindedness. And others have used it too. This goes back to Ken Osborne, who is, I can talk about later, one of the great marvels of higher education and social studies education. Actually, it goes back before that to the American Historical Association's 1895 or something like that recommendation about what history should be.
Okay.
And that's that we take the kinds of things we do when we think historically. So that's like contemplate evidence, think about perspective, think about causes and consequences, and so on and so forth. And we apply them to the world that we're living in now. So this is the citizenship piece. So when we're reading false news, we can go, you know what, I think I need to read another story about the same thing and get a different perspective on it today. And then I'll read another one and get a different perspective on it, because there's a multiplicity of these. Or when I'm thinking about cause and consequence, what caused something in ancient Athens, it's more important that I'm thinking about cause and consequence of what happened in the last election in the U.S. or in what caused that? What are the consequences that might come or will be?
Right.
So knowledge matters, ideas matter, but how we think about knowledge matters, and how we apply that knowledge in our lived experience matters as well.
Right.
And I would say one matters more than the other, and one matters more than the other.
Well, and there seems to be this fascinating dichotomy, maybe even dilemma between, I guess you could call it knowledge and reasoning, or knowledge and intelligence, or knowledge and critical thought. And it's a difficult one, because you can't have an education system without both. It's impossible. It's almost, to use an analogy, if the facts that we are imbibing are the pillars, and the ideas are the roof or the canvas that protects us from the rain, well, you can't have one without the other. If you just put a bunch of facts in the ground, it doesn't carry anything. It means nothing. It provides no value. But at the same time, if you just have one grand idea, well, it'll blow off with the wind. It's not tethered to anything. And of course, if a canvas is tethered to one single fact, well, that's not much of a roof at all. It's just unidimensional. And I don't mean to get carried away with this analogy, but what I'm getting at is that they have to go hand in hand, and the only way for us to understand how this works is to have this causal reasoning that you've talked about. And in the 20th century, there were a lot of studies that were initiated in the United States and in Canada and in Europe to try to understand why there was this illiteracy in science. So we have suddenly a literacy rate of 98, 99%, a wonderful achievement for the human species to have literacy be at 99% in most Western countries. Sometimes it gets as high as 100%. That's phenomenal. If you compared our species or our civilization to even 200 years ago or 100 years ago, that's an achievement. But in science, people don't know the most basic of facts. Whether it's the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun, or that the purpose of antibiotics is for bacteria and not for viruses. The basic facts that underpin our society. But what they argued that the solution is to take a deficit approach and to just try to fill minds with the right facts. But it was mistaken, because you can't know everything. It's okay not to know that antibiotics have nothing to do with viruses if you're not a doctor and you don't need antibiotics. It's okay, because it's available to us in other forms. There may be other things that you need to know. Instead, what scholars have argued since then is that we need to take an approach to reasoning and critical thinking. So that if you want to be scientifically literate, you need to know what the ideas and the forces are that are at play in science, so that you know when someone says to you that the universe rotates around the Earth, they're probably mistaken. Even if you don't know exactly how that has been proved wrong, you know that it's inaccurate because you've been able to reason appropriately. Would you say that that's a value in our education system, and that's something that we should strive for? Or maybe we being too simplistic about it?
Well, I think knowledge is a funny thing, and I'm not being original in my thought here. This goes back to Plato. And when he describes the life of Socrates was told in the Apology, he says, in the Apology where he's being condemned for corrupting the youth, Socrates' response is, well, listen to this story. It's kind of like someone went to the oracle at Delphi and said, who's the smartest or most educated person in Athens? And the answer was Socrates. This person goes to Socrates and says, hey, dude, you're the most educated guy in all of Athens. And he says, no, I'm not. I'm going to prove you wrong. So he goes around and he talks to everyone who he thinks is smarter than he is. The lawyers, the poets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he realized that they all knew stuff, but what they didn't know, what they knew they took very certainly, right? And so Socrates said, I probably am the wisest man in Athens, because I know that I know nothing compared to what there is to know.
Right.
So his approach to the world was, you can't stop inquiring. Because once you presume to know something, then it stops. You stop learning about that thing.
Right.
And so Socrates' mission in life was to go around proving to everyone in Athens that they didn't know anything, which of course made them mad, and then this led to the charges and so on and so forth.
Right.
So knowledge is a tricky thing, and it's also dangerous, and it's also, in a way, dangerous in the sense that once we think we have it in our hands, whatever that fact is, whatever that tidbit is, then we never go looking further into it.
Right.
Oh, I know all about Greek history.
Yeah.
I don't know, actually know nothing about it, even though I've been reading it my whole life.
Sure.
Right? And if I didn't take that approach, I would never learn anything at all. I would never learn anything more. So to actually learn, you need to presume that you don't know.
Right.
Which is a paradox. Right?
It's absolutely a paradox, because we're living in a time of disruption where part of the problem, I think, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but part of the problem that we're facing is everything is open to question, including whether the Earth is flat or round. It really is. And of course, anyone who's a scientist would say, well, you're open to make the argument. You're absolutely entitled to propose a hypothesis and try to prove it. Right. You're not entitled to your own facts, but you're entitled to try to prove this. And that's an important part of science, but no one has ever proven this. In fact, it's pretty much ridiculous, because the fact that the Earth is round is self-evident. But we live in a world now where everything is open to question, and academics like yourself are branded as elites who have an agenda and who aren't actually being Socratic because they think they know everything. But most professors I know would profess to know very little, because they have this thirst for ongoing knowledge. But it is a paradox, because, for example, a government or an education system cannot operate on the assumption that we know nothing. It must operate on certain assumptions of knowledge, even if those come to be corrected in the future. So how do we, in the education system, in our politics, how do we grapple with this paradox?
I think it's one of the ways we do it already is in these science experiments you might have remembered from elementary school or secondary school. And when I was growing up, I was thought that there was like a right answer to do this and a wrong way to do it. And then I read Popper's work on falsifiability. If something's not falsifiable, if you can't attempt to prove it wrong or prove it wrong, then it's not science.
Right.
Which is his criticism of Freud, right?
Mm-hmm.
For Freud was a pseudoscientist because whenever he was criticized, he'd come up with what Popper called an ad hoc hypothesis or answer. So you have an avoidance complex. No, I don't. Okay, then you have an Oedipal complex. There's always something that pops up to answer it.
Right.
And so I think the other way, I think we're doing it, at least in the areas I know best in social studies and history, is despite the fact that we're not making the reforms now that we are called to make, the previous reforms to the Ontario Social Studies and History curriculum were actually amazing. They have no overall expectations, which, by the way, are the ones that teachers report on in the report cards, that are knowledge-based or fact-based. It's all about historical inquiry. So you have to do these historical thinking. You have to approach every subject, and there's still subjects there that are listed, but it's how you think about them that's actually being measured. And I can't really comment on what's going on in new math or science right now.
Right.
But I do know that an inquiry approach to history education threw a lot of teachers for the loop because they learned history through a textbook or through overheads,
right,
or PowerPoint.
Right.
So I've talked to teachers who said about historical thinking, and they've said, so I can just keep my old PowerPoint and add in a slide at the beginning? No, you can't. It's a paradigmatic shift in the way history education has to happen.
Right.
You can't focus on the content. So there's this old chestnut by Ken Osborne, who I mentioned earlier, around historical mindedness, who went into a history classroom, and I think it was somewhere in Winnipeg, I believe. But it might have been in Saskatchewan. I can't remember the exact location, but it doesn't matter. He's in a classroom, and the teacher's got notes on the board, and the kids are taking notes on World War II.
Yeah. So
he leans over to one of the kids, and he goes, so what are you learning about? And the kid goes, I'm learning how to take notes. The history just went right through the whole, there's no point.
Right.
All they learned is how to take notes.
All you're learning really is to reproduce in order to pass the class. And, you see this all the time, not only in public schools, but in universities, where your entire goal is to get the best grade you can get, and that's it. And it doesn't matter what's in and out the brain. It's to achieve a grade. And therefore, you're learning how to get a grade, as opposed to learning how to do history.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
It's what I've called and others have called the right answer compromise. And some of the highest achieving students, not all of them, have learned how this works. So they go to the teacher and go, tell me exactly what will get me an A.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go do that.
Right.
But they also have to be capable of doing it. But still, tell me what you want from me, and I will do it because I want that grade.
Right, and that goes back to this whole idea that education is about producing someone who is ready for their career. And if your career is about getting the right answer and delivering on expectations, then great. But unfortunately, I think we live in a world where that's rapidly changing, where if your job is to reproduce day in and day out the same thing over and over again, then your job is probably going to be done by a robot fairly soon. It's going to be automated. And I don't mean to be glib or fear-mongering, but that seems to be the path that we're on. And so this idea that you are educated and critically thinking about the world around you and can do more than just reproduce what is asked of you, that seems to be a pretty important skill to have going forward. So we're coming to the end of our time. My final question is, what do you think we've missed in this conversation? What do you think we haven't grappled with when it comes to education, the history of education, the future of education, and the current, you can even call it a crisis of education, especially Ontario? What have we not talked about that maybe we can do in the future?
I think the most important thing that we haven't discussed really at length is the importance of educational history and understanding contemporary history and the direction we're going to go. So you mentioned my career trajectory. I was a classroom teacher and never thought I was going to become an academic. This is not a job I really kind of knew existed. Like, I knew it existed, but I was going to be a classroom teacher. That's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But I was frustrated all the time, and almost maybe not daily, but all the time. And most of the questions I had in my head were, how did things end up this way? Why is it that when I go to my classroom and close the door, and then grade 3 teacher next door closes her door, that where you have totally different understandings of what we're doing in the classroom? I've got my kids standing on the desks, probably I shouldn't have, and they're reading from the box, and this is a bit of hyperbole, and so I started asking questions and reading about the history of education, and eventually one teacher I worked with said, you really just need to go back to school, Ted.
Right.
So then I fully expected that I would answer all my questions about how schools ended up the way they did, and go back to my classroom and put a degree on the wall, and just at least have an understanding of why things looked the way they did. Of course, I've continued to look because I still have many, many questions about the history of education. Yeah. But it wasn't some obtuse or rare, knowledge that I was gaining. It was knowledge that helped me understand what's going on in the classrooms, because I could see its historical antecedents. I could go, oh, I understand why this teacher sees things this way, because of this or that, or that why the curriculum looks the way it does, because I've seen what came before. And so if you want to be any kind of educational policy, I would argue, any kind of policy or decision that has to be made about public education should be historically informed. Otherwise, it's going to do nothing but perpetuate this, what they've called a pendulum. We've talked about traditional and progressive education. But I really think it's kind of more like two currents in the same stream. Sometimes one overtakes the other. Right. But if you know they're there, and you understand why things look the way they do, then you can try not to just replicate the same curriculum from 1998. You can go, okay, what have we learned from that? And then move forward. Right. So my final thesis would be that there's nothing more practical than history of education, even though it might seem like an academic subject. Right.
Well, what could be more important than having inquiry about inquiry? Inquiring about the way in which we inquire of our world. And that might even sound solipsistic, but I think that what you're getting at is that this is a practical pursuit with practical problems and practical outcomes in our world today. And that's actually quite an inspiring place to leave us. So thank you so much for coming on the program, Ted.
Thank you again.
All right, that's the show. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. I hope that it made you think, or at least gave you some food for thought. And if it did, I'd love to hear what those thoughts are. You can reach out to me with those and your suggestions for future episodes, whether it's a guest that you want to have on or a subject that you'd like to have tackled. Email me, woegoshow@gmail.com, or go to the website, woegoshow.com, and find links to social media. You can reach out there. You can find also all other previous episodes and listen to them. Give me your thoughts on those as well. I'd love to hear from you. Now, your quote of the week is from Martin Luther King Jr. Here goes. Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. The function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education. Thanks for listening. Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this show was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and that you can also catch it every Tuesday on CHMR in St. John's, Newfoundland. Thanks again.